welcome. Oh, okay. Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you today about Joan and my trip to the Galapagos a year ago. The Galapagos Islands are here about 600 miles due west of the country of Ecuador, straddling the equator, and their position has some interesting relationships to some of the animals that you will find there. The Galapagos are probably most familiar to people and be in association with Charles Darwin's 5-week visit. And most people, because there's so much talk about it, somebody spent a lot of time there. He spent 5 weeks out of the 5-year worldwide cruise, and I won't say cruise, voyage, not a cruise then, on the HMS Beagle. There are many wonderful publications and films about the islands, and you may have seen some of the videos on television. But from our perspective, being there was very different. Walking on the islands, observing the unique species of plants and animals, and geographical features that contributed to Darwin's development of the theory of biological and geological change over long periods of time. The archipelago is composed of 6 main islands, 12 smaller islands, and more than 40 islets. There are 2 general patterns to notice in the archipelago. One is that the more western islands, Fernandina and Isabella, are larger, and then as you move east, it's not a perfect gradient. In general, the islands become smaller. The western islands are the most volcanically active, that is, currently active, for example, on Fernandina or on Isabella, and just by the diagram you can see which ones retain the major volcanic cauldrons. As you look at more eastern islands and more southern ones, you see some evidence in the diagram of some calderas, but in general, they've been inactive for a long time, and they show a good deal of considerable erosion. The 4 islands that Darwin visited were Cristobal, Floriana, Santiago, and Isabella. Even though he only visited 4 of them, the 4 that he did visit represented a good diversity of islands, where he went to islands that were relatively new and then to islands that were older, and that was significant in him seeing the changes over time. The only island in which we went where we would have, quote, walked in his footsteps was Floriana Island. The Galapagos Islands were never connected to the South American mainland, and this is particularly significant in explaining the uniqueness of the plants and animals found there. Pioneering plants and animals would have arrived by chance in the water, floating on debris, or in the air. Their survival subsequently would have depended on their ability to adapt to the varying environmental conditions found on the different islands. During the presentation, note the number of endemic species that I refer to, and these are species of plants and animals that are found only on the Galapagos. After a day's tour of Quito, Ecuador, Joan and I arrived in the Galapagos at the island of Baltra. The single airstrip there was built by the U.S. during World War II in agreement with Ecuador to protect the western end of the Panama Canal. Our home away from home was the Tip Top 2, and the way that we got around between different islands was on a panga. Okay. Now, the animals on the Galapagos, as you may well know, are really very tolerant of humans. They just seem like they're tame, okay? And they were our constant companions On the boat, you'll see frigates and brown pelican, and then in the lower left one, usually some sea lion would haul up onto the back of our boat as well. Okay. And they were also greeters on dry landings up the top or on beaches where we went to the different islands. Whoops, I'll put that one right here. Now, and of course, tourists like to take pictures, and it seemed like this was true of most of the animals, but they did seem like they were posing for you all the time because they did stay so still while you moved around. We did see some more aggressive behavior, and I understand all of the behavior which seems so tame. That is their normal behavior. But on one beach, we saw two big bull sea lions fighting it out with one another. And behind that, further back, there are two gulls called the red-eyed gulls, and would have loved to catch them in the process, but they had just been successful in fending off a frigate that was trying to capture their chick that had slipped down in the rock there. But overall, animals were very tolerant of tourists. Now let's look at some of the islands that we visited and see what we saw on them in terms of biological specimens as well as geological features. On Santa Cruz, we saw a collapsed volcano caldera, walk down into walk down and along a really huge volcanic lava tube, and observe 3 different species of giant tortoises. Now, on this particular first slide, you'll notice in the slide up to the left, you'll notice the layers of basaltic rock in the wall of the caldera, and in the other view, down here deeply, perhaps it's not that obvious there, but if you saw it close up, the brown rubble down here is the top of the volcanic cone that had collapsed. And when I looked at this, I said to myself, it would be interesting to contemplate whether this was kind of serving like an island on an island, and that is, here's a deep caldera, and I don't know how long ago it collapsed, and think about, it's really an isolated environment. And I just wonder if a few, say, giant tortoises managed to tumble down into there in the past, and just wonder that over the eons of time in that closed environment where they can't get back up and intermate with other members of their species might have accumulated the same types of genetic variations that would ultimately distinguish themselves from their prior species. And of course, that's the primary point that happened in the islands. As animals were distributed by chance to different islands, they were subject to different selective pressures on those islands, and over time came to vary from one another significantly. Now, while we were there, I climbed up on the caldera wall. I did look down while I was, and turned around, I did look down, and I think some of the other tourists were talking to Joan about how much life insurance I was carrying. But I wanted to take a picture of this forest in the highlands, and it's called the Scalesia Forest. It's there because of the mist that's brought up by the cool southeast trade winds. And when you look at it, you say, wow, that could be just a really rich northern forest as well. But they're not woody, they're not our typical trees. These trees are related, they're in the same family as sunflowers and daisies, believe it or not. So it's a very different type of tree. After leaving that area, we went and to the left is actually people climbing back out. But anyhow, the large picture, people walking into this huge lava tube. And it's now empty, through which molten lava once flowed down the surface of the original mountain. And we did get into a second one on another island as well. Then we went to a giant tortoise they call it a preserve. They actually called it a ranch. And we observed giant tortoises. These empty tortoise shells in their kind of little waiting area before you go out in the field give a good size comparison to humans. And one of the pictures I took of a tortoise in the field, and you can actually see why you need to see that original size comparison, because it doesn't look so big out here. But what I want you to notice in particular at the moment is the shape of the dome of the tortoise here, and then also the shape of the curvature of this dorsal part, or the carapace, right behind the head of the animal to compare with subsequent slides. We next went down and weren't able to get into the Darwin Research Station, unfortunately, but in this area we were able to see some others, and so we came upon a different species. Notice that its dorsal shell is really much larger, but what's significant is if you notice the curvature here above the head, it's a little sharper. This was very kind of comical. There were about 8 of these backed into a stone wall, and it was like they had, got together and said, okay, you back in first, and I'll back in beside you, and etc. But they're obviously getting away from the hot sun. Further along, I got a better picture of this, but this is Lonesome George. This is the last specimen of one of the species. And one of the things you see significantly here is this very high curvature to the front of his shell, his carapace. Now, what they're doing at the research center, and been doing for a long time, is they're trying to reestablish this species by, they were trying a natural mating or artificial fertilization, with females of other species in hopes of getting fertile hybrid offspring, then growing them, and you'd have to do it for many years, and then doing back crosses and possibly trying to, reestablish the original species. They have, as yet, had no initial reproductive success. Now, moving to the next one, this is a picture to the left of, I'm going to call him Curious George, Lonesome George in the light of day. Again, you can see the high curvature of the shell, and then to the right, you can see the adaptive significance of that. The animal can reach up and out and higher with its head and jaw than those other tortoises show. And that's the type of variation that you find among the tortoises. An additional activity at the Research Center is a hatch and release program, essentially. What they do is they go out to a particular island during a breeding season, and they collect eggs, bring them back into the lab, incubate them, hatch them, grow them in the lab to a size that they would be able to survive against any kind of predators. And unfortunately, one of the things on the islands, there's a lot of feral animals. There are goats, there are pigs, there are rats, there are dogs, and they have been trying very much to eradicate these non-native organisms from the environment so they don't continue to interfere with the natural endemic species. And so what they do eventually is then they'll take these back and repopulate the island from which they came. Right. Now, a plant that's certainly, you might say, a kind of an icon of the Galapagos is the various species of the Uptunia cacti, and there are many endemic species. And this just shows a small arrangement of the variations that you see in the cactuses around the islands. And so like the one here in the lower part is low, has the cactus pads, there are a few buds here, it's a typical cactus flower up there, but there are others that are higher, and then when we were at the research station, we could see some of these others that are really very tall, you say like tree-like cactuses. And what the various animals, tortoises if they can get at them, flowers. Now, a different island we went to, we weren't up in an airplane, but I pulled this offline, was Genovese. It's a northern island. And basically, it has what happened on Santa Cruz, and that is where you have the rim of Darwin's Bay here, okay, was the rim of a volcanic mountain. And the volcanic mountain collapsed into the bay. This bay is 60 meters deep. And either then or later, this outer portion of it became breached and it filled with water. So in this case, it's a deep caldera, just happens to be filled with water. Now, when we were there, we spent some time on a beach down here. We snorkeled in this area here. But particularly, we went over here and climbed up what they call Prince Philip Steps to get up on top of the plateau. And so they really kind of just a rough layout of steps. They did put up some rails, so these are some of our tourist colleagues going up and eventually coming down. This wall is this wall over here is about 25 meters high. Now, up on top, two things I want to put in perspective. Here's the steps we came up. Then we have what they call the Palo Santo trees up in here with a lot of interesting birds. And then over on this edge, which would be here, and the ocean out here, is lava from the side of the original mountain. And I first want to look at this and what it shows for us. On this plateau here of lava, there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of storm petrels. Between the lava here and then the basaltic shelf back here, between here and back here, there's a fairly deep crevice, but lots of crevices over the surface of the lava. And the storm petrels will nest in the various crevices and hopefully to protect themselves and their chicks from this little bird here, a short-eared owl. And it's kind of a different owl in the sense that it doesn't hunt at night. It doesn't hunt by flying around and then swooping down to catch its prey. It will stand either on top by some crevices or go down into crevices and sit in these recesses. And then in some of the side areas where the petrels nest, it'll sit there, and apparently when it senses any kind of movement in these crevices, it simply will lunge its talons and legs into the crevice and catch whatever is in there. Back on top, we saw certainly frigate birds. The wide wingspan of this bird relative to its very light body weight makes them fantastic aerial pirates. And so they really don't feed directly themselves. What they do is they harass other birds that have caught a fish to either drop it so they'll swoop down and catch it in the air, or they will simply steal it from them in the air. Down at the bottom we have a female great frigate and a male to the left with his expanded bright red throat pouch. Then in the next slide we have a frigate with a collapsed pouch here, and then the frigate down here, which I said has an inflated ego. Shows a little bit more about his display. He pumps air into this pouch. The head would stick up a little bit more. You can see that he's lifting his wings up. And when females fly overhead, he will make himself very obvious and then let out this very pronounced screech. And when one does, then many do. And it was very impressive to see maybe 24 of these doing at the same time and hearing this cacophony of noise and coloration as the females flew overhead. Now, other birds on that area were red-footed boobies, a Nazca booby. None of these, by the way, are endemic, nor the frigates. And then I included a picture of the better-known blue-footed booby, although it's not found on this island. I did it for a comparison with the others, as you'll see. You'll notice the red-footed booby can flex its actual feet around a branch. They nest in the trees. The Nazca's and the bluefoot, even it's not flexing its foot, it's just flexing its foot essentially at the angle, can't nest in the trees, so they nest on the ground in very rudimentary nests. And now one is seen here with a Nazca booby sitting on an egg with all of these twigs underneath there. To the right, I've included a slide that I wish we could have stayed this morning. It was the last morning, and of course invariably the tour guide says, no, we've got to leave. But these were just beginning to get into the famous display between them called the skying display. And what the males, he had started doing it, he will point his head straight up in the air, point his tail straight up in the air, lift his wings up as far as he can, and here's the female watching him. It's also coupled with the famous and kind of humorous blue booby two-foot step, where they stand there opposite one another and they do this. They keep bouncing from one foot to the other. Not a good rendition of it, but anyhow. A different island we went to was Bartolome. And Bartolome Island is a relatively new in a geological sense island, but it's not volcanically active anymore. But what we see on this slope are some of the pioneer plants that are invading it. And this one here is kind of particularly interesting. When you look at it and you say, well, okay, there's some plants up here, but they're green. But there's plants down here and they look like they're white. How are they metabolizing? Don't they photosynthesize? Well, it turns out this particular species of plant, all the leaves are covered by little silver hair-like projections. And those protect the leaves from excessive evaporation in the incessant sun, and they also reflect the sun. So they aren't as strange as we might seem another way. This is a little different cactus, not an Opuntia cactus, but a different species that we found higher up on the islands. And then as we climb up, there was a wooden stair place to climb up. And if any of you are familiar with Jacob's ladder, they said it was 600 steps beside the flat areas. I'm more inclined to think it was probably about 1,000, and it was brutally hot this day. And the higher up we went, we saw this kind of lunar landscape. And in various places you saw these cone-like structures on the side, and they're called parasitic or spatter cones. And what they developed from was you have the main magma chamber that uplifted the main part of the mountain, but there are side channels that may be feeding off of it, so lava will flow out to the side and then up to form these little volcanic cones. Now, I call them icons. Certainly one of the icons of the Galapagos are the endemic marine iguanas. These iguanas are on Hispaniola, the oldest island, and they show some coloration there that you don't see on iguanas that are on Hispaniola is quite east and south, so therefore an older island. And so you got this color variation, which itself is indicative of continued evolutionary change among iguanas on different islands. They eat in the ocean. They scrape algae off the substrate, and then when they come out of the cold water, they have to warm their bodies up, so they'll sit on the sand or preferably on these black volcanic rocks, position themselves sideways to the sun to absorb maximum heat. Because they feed on marine plants, they're going to, of course, have what we call a salt load, but this is dealt with because they have evolved nasal glands by which they excrete the salt, just as you may be familiar with in marine birds. The one at the bottom was the last morning. We went out, we got up, they said, we're going to go out and we want you up at 5 o'clock for breakfast, and then we go out. So we went out real early because it was only a partial day. So we managed to see this when we were walking along the island of this mass of iguanas. And in the evening, what they'll do is they'll climb up in the shrubbery into this kind of big group to keep warm, because the evenings are very cool in spite of the very hot days. And then in the mornings, one of the things she was lucky to see, we could literally see these tumbling out of the shrubbery, coming down on the sand, and then going to do the same thing the other iguanas did, that is, get themselves in a position to heat up for their activities of the day. An invertebrate that I wanted to show you were the famous Sally Lightfoot crabs. Okay? Now, their young are small, pitch black, and therefore well camouflaged. Obviously, the adults here, and then I pulled this in as a picture so you could really see how colorful they are very, very colorful and very obvious on the rocks. And in some ways, it presents perhaps a little bit of a problem in kind of explaining this, because this would seemingly make them very visible to predators. Okay, it may likely have something to do with their with mating or reproduction, or some other function. But they certainly are very interesting to see. Now, a different type of island that we went on was South Plaza Island. And this island is what we call a direct uplift island. That it is not an island that's resulted from prior volcanic activity. Okay, it's just risen up. And so it's a flat plateau, and it has a very high cliff along the southern side of it here. We were here at the end of the rainy season, and it has a fairly homogeneous mat of what's called sea purslane or sesuvium, and that's seen down here in the corner. And then in the dry season, all of that will turn reddish, brownish, yellowish color. So what you see, it's a fairly, in a sense, barren except for these plants, and then more where we first came on here, there are cacti. When we did come ashore at the dry landing, what we kind of was neat to find was, I swear, this first land lizard, which is the other iguana you find on the island and is really less well known than the marine, came kind of walking along towards us. And so we watched him a bit, and then he wandered off a bit, found a cactus pad here, grabbed it, moved along, manipulated it with his jaw and his claws, and then all of a sudden, gulp, it's gone like a good reptile would do. Land iguana, if they weren't doing this, they might be up in the shrubs, just climb up in the shrubs, and this is here, it is not too evident, but deep in the shrubs, just feeding on the foliage there. And then another, you kind of always look for these interesting ones. Another thing is they might have climbed down, get out of the sun, and this particular one, this big land iguana, is literally nose to nose with this immature one, which is black. And they're lined up perfectly with that trunk of the cactus in the shade. Both iguanas nest in a similar manner. Not surprising, they dig burrows in the very hard substrate. In one place, we could see them, a lot of them going around scratching, and the tour guide said, well, they'll just keep doing that until they find a place that's just a little softer so they can actually dig a burrow. And the burrows obviously could also serve as recesses to get out of the sun. They also could be a place to escape aerial predators such as the Galapagos hawk. Now, another reptile that we saw is the lava lizard. It's endemic, and the male and the female on the right were displaying to one another, but to get them bigger, I just cut the photo and then brought them together this way. The female's a little more bright than the male, and they have an interesting display, and it's the same thing as their threat display. They will kind of wag their heads back and forth, and then they do a little interesting, what I refer to as the lava lizard push-ups, and they literally will keep going up and down like this on wherever they are. Now, this again is just to highlight. There are 7 species of lava lizards, and 6 of them are each separated, are on a separate island, and then one of them happens to be on several islands. Now, ironically, and I think everybody in the group was pretty disappointed, was that Darwin's finches, if you hear about Darwin, you hear about the Galapagos, you're going to hear about Darwin's finches. These were the ones that didn't stay still for you, not for a second. And it was very hard to get good pictures of them. So I'm showing you some of my generally out-of-focus pictures, and I honestly have looked at these very carefully and can't really classify them, and that's not necessarily a cactus finch just because it's sitting on the cactus. What you can see maybe a little vaguely is that the beak on this one is kind of small and thin. This one, it's hard to say, but it protrudes out. But this one is particularly interesting. You can see how it's such a deep beak. And then to just show you that variation, there's certainly color variation among Darwin's finches. And because you can see there's some difference in the head sizes, we know you could assume that there are body size differences. But what's really different among them is different sizes and shapes of their beaks that relate to what they eat. And again, as I point out in the beginning, the variety of islands provided different types of food opportunities, and those that had the ability gradually to eat that type of food source would have evolved variations, adaptive to it. Now, on the islands of Fernandina and Isabella is another iconic animal, the endemic cormorant, wingless cormorant. Obviously, the wings are reduced. It hops around the rocks using the wings for balance and doing that, but it is very efficient, diving into the water and then catching its food with its beak as it protrudes it in among the rocks in the water. And then it comes back over to the rocks and it hops back up the rocks. And it always sits in this particular position with the wings out like this, because one of the things that has to do, it has to dry its wings out completely, because it lacks any appreciable amount of the oil, the preening oil that you would associate with other seabirds. And I didn't get to these islands, so I had to borrow the slides. And then, of course, we have the really cute Galapagos penguin. It's one of the smallest penguins and the only one to nest in the tropics, which again should bring the question up of what in the world is a penguin doing in the tropics? Well, it really seems quite reasonable that its progenitor population in past eons would have been swept up in the cold and nutrient-rich waters of the Humboldt Current up the western coast of South America. They're quite small and kind of cute to watch. Other endemic birds I wanted to just bring to your attention to highlight that. A flycatcher up in the left. This is a really curious little one, and the tour guide, when we were out on that particular island, said, "Don't worry if it lands on your head or your shoulder. It usually does." And then the dove has a little different color than we usually think about. And it's an interesting one because it is the pollinator of cacti on Genovese Island, because there are no bees on Genovese Island. And people who have researched this have determined that the spines on the cacti in Genovese Island are softer than compared with other islands where there are bees. And then down the bottom we have a mockingbird, and again, 4 species, 3 of which are separated individually to 3 different islands and 1 on several islands. Additionally, other endemic birds, and you'll notice they all have this kind of steel blue, gray, black, gray coloration. A lot of incidences over and over again of protected coloration to the volcanic rock coloration. And unfortunately, this hawk, we had to take a picture of him in the wrong way. We had followed him all day, all of the time we were on this island, and he was way off in the field, and the tour guide kept saying, well, there's the hawk, there's the hawk. So we walked way out here, we walked all the way back, and son of a gun, who didn't appear on this metal structure, not a lighthouse, but some kind of a structure there where we started out. So we did get a picture, but it's obviously you can't see his true coloration here, which was a dark kind of brownish color. But here is an endemic predator on the island. Another gull that we saw, in addition to that lava gull, is a red-eyed swallowtail gull. And whenever you read about it, they say endemic ? And the reason is because there's a small population of these on an island off of Colombia. And so the question becomes, did these come from Colombia, or did some fly from the Galapagos to there and establish kind of a little side population? Interesting question. But at any rate, these have some interesting adaptations. They're the only gull that's known to feed at sea at night. So they will fly out to sea, way out to sea at night, seeking their favorite food, squid. And the squid have a luminescent nature to them. And there are 2 interesting adaptations related to this. People who have researched them have determined that in the retina of the eyes, there is a higher proportion than you might expect otherwise in other birds of cells that are called rods. And rods are those cells in the retinas of your eye that are responsive to low light incidence. And then the second one is that people have determined that they've developed an echolocation device, apparently involving some kind of clicking noise of the beak, so that when they fly back to the island late at night from where they were, they produce these sounds, apparently bounce off the cliff, and they can therefore tell whether they're flying towards the cliff, adjust their flight, and fly up above it. Very quickly, some non-endemic species, but I wanted to show you them. Green sea turtle, the only one that nests in the island. And we saw this sequence on the first morning, and it's very atypical because they don't usually lumber up the beaches to lay their eggs until the evening. And it went up, we went off for a walk, came back, darn if it wasn't coming down, and the tour guide said, no, this is not normal. But that is what a turtle nest would look like. We saw tropic birds, beautiful. You might look up and say, I wonder what one it is, but if you see those very long caudal feathers, you're going to know it is a tropic bird. Flamingos, great blue heron here, standing like a statue, and he must have been doing that for, I don't know, well over an hour. And what he's doing is spreading his wings like this to show the underside that's not covered in feathers. And then he's vibrating his mouth, essentially panting, and then his feathers on the rest of the body will be somewhat fluffed out. All of that together is a thermoregulatory mechanism of dissipating excess body heat. We saw a couple of these are a couple of the shorebirds we saw. And then finally, the tour companies have maintained the famous tradition of whalers from the past where they left a barrel on Floriana, and they would put mail in the barrel, and then the next whaling ship would come through, going in the opposite direction, pick it up, take it home, deliver it to the addressees. So now what each tour guide does, and that's our Carlos, he took them all out, and then he just kept reading off the addresses, and then people in our group said, oh, hey, I live near there, and et cetera, would take them, and the idea was that they would hand deliver them when they get home. We did wonder about the woman from Boston who took the stack this high, and we wondered if she really was going to do something with it. But anyhow, so we made ours out, and it does work. My son received his in Corning a week later, and somebody had brought it to his apartment and stuck it in the door. And the two grandchildren got theirs in a couple of weeks, although they were mailed to them, and I have to confess that the one I had for Livonia kind of hung around a while, and I finally thought, I better stick it in the mail with a note and at least mail it to them. And then I just leave you with the final paragraph from Darwin's Origin of the Species. And I'd be more than willing to, in the few minutes left, answer any questions. But since I've talked so long, Joan has agreed to answer all questions. Yeah.